Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host, and glad you're here. This is round two with Thomas More. I spoke with him about 4 or 5 years ago on episode 50, and now we're getting close to 100. And so maybe it was 4 years ago. And now we're celebrating almost 100th episode, and Thomas More is 98. Been a long time doing this, folks. It's a fantastic endeavor, and I'm glad you're here to participate in the project. I'm going to introduce Thomas and then get some housekeeping details, and then we'll get started. Thomas More is the author of The Eloquence of Silence and 24 other books about bringing soul to our personal lives and culture, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Care of the Soul. He has been a Catholic monk and university professor and is also a psychotherapist influenced mainly by C.G. Jung and James Hillman. His work brings together spirituality, mythology, depth psychology, and the arts, emphasizing the importance of images, and imagination. I notice when I go through these episodes, I want to quote, I want to extract quotes, and I find myself wanting to quote Thomas a lot. Thank you for participating, Thomas. I greatly appreciate it, and it's great to have you continuing to support the project here at The Sacred Speaks. So I look forward to the next time. Check him out at Thomas More Soul, ThomasMooreSoul.com. Great website there. Also, as far as news is concerned, got another workshop coming up at Esalen on the 23rd through the 27th of October. So you can look below in the show notes and check out that link for our workshop on ecstatic experience, music, and Jung's Red Book. If that is of interest to you, please come on out and sign up because we'll probably fill up pretty quickly. Also, just continuing the process, if you're interested in these ideas of psychotherapy and spirituality and how they come together, we've been working on a wellness center called the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences. My wife and I started this many years ago, and it mixes together the depth work, contemplation, psychotherapy, yoga, acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine. It's a really good place to do this work that this podcast has certainly been interested in looking at investigating. We've got a great team of folks that we work with closely and that are mindful about how they're approaching the work of healing and the work of suffering. So if you're looking for someone, check us out at the Center for HAS.com. As always, The Sacred Speaks is, of course, brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences, also supported by Modern Nations with their song Clouds. And if you hang out to the end of the episode, you can listen to the whole entire selection. And I think that's it for now. We'll leave it there. Thanks for being here. Thank you for your support for this project. Please like and share and pass it along. That's how it grows. And again, if you're looking for somebody to do depth work or be introspective with, reach out to the center. Enjoy the episode. We'll leave it there. Thomas More, this is cool, man. You and I connected a long time ago. It must have been like 4 years ago. And we were just chatting about, at least my memory is that I really enjoyed our discussion, and the opportunity to reconnect with you is lovely. So welcome to the Sacred Speaks.
Thank you for joining up with me today. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we're talking about The Eloquence of Silence, this book you've written amongst many books you've written. We can meander around all those, but we're really going to dig into a subject that I think is really difficult for a lot of Westerners to grasp for a number of reasons. But as I was reading this text, I got so excited because we're going to talk about Eastern traditions and Western traditions and music and psychotherapy and, oh my gosh, Joseph Campbell and his stories. And so you've really provided us a lot of a field of opportunity here. So thanks for that.
Good.
I want to begin certainly just with an open question for you. Of course, the significance of this book, but I want to do a little seed planting, so maybe you can navigate around this subject, because this idea of kenosis is something that my wife and I were talking about this morning. I said, it's really interesting. People are constantly going to Eastern traditions to experience or look for this idea of non-attachment or emptiness. And the irony is that Westerners have that in the certainly in the Christian lineage and where in the Greek arena. So, would you introduce this idea of the eloquence of silence? What brought you to it? And then I've got a list of questions to dive in as we navigate.
Yes, I don't know where to begin because when I was a kid, I was really a kid. I was a monk in a Catholic religious order. I started that when I was 13, and I stayed with it till I was 26. So I learned a lot about silence. That was a big issue for monastic life. And so the idea of silence is very, very familiar to me, and it's close to me. And I still like silence very much. I like quiet too. Actually, I prefer quiet to silence. Quiet meaning I don't have to say nothing. It's not that kind of silence, absolute silence, but it's living a basically quiet life. And I like that. I do that and like it. And I feel that even now, I'm 82 now, and I left the monastic life when I was 26. And I feel like I'm still living it to some extent. And part of that is to live a quiet life, a contemplative life. And there's a certain kind of, maybe not absolute, but a kind of emptying that goes on with that. You empty out the temptation to talk too much and to say too many things and speak unnecessarily. I mean, I don't do that to any extreme, to a fault, I think. But I like the atmosphere of quiet, and I like to be quiet at times, like when I'm practicing therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I often note those times where the best thing for me to do is not say anything.
Nothing. Yeah.
So those moments are really important too. So what I'm saying in answer to your question is that this idea of emptiness and silence has been part of my life since I can remember practically. And I've never had a chance to really focus in on it. I became attracted to traditional stories and passages I found in books that gave images of emptiness, like empty pots and
Mm-hmm.
empty hands and things. And sometimes I think when I'm at a restaurant and I'm supposed to meet someone and I'm sitting across from the empty chair when they don't show up, I think that that's really a good practice in emptiness. So I try to grasp the deeper possibilities in such a moment. I take it as a sign that it's time to reflect on emptiness.
Mm. What a beautiful image. My thought as you're saying that is that, and I don't want to bash Western anything. I love this tradition. I think it's very rich. I will critique it, and I think that's important. The criticism that came up was how often we're concerned about filling ourselves. I spend a lot of time with psychotherapy folks that I'm working with, and there's of course from money to romantic partners to a home to children to all kinds of filling our lives. The idea of emptiness seems kind of scary to a lot of folks, I think, or that there's something wrong, that in our aloneness that we're supposed to be lonely. Would you speak to that?
Yes, the idea that when something is empty, that there's something wrong. Like if you're
Yeah.
not speaking, what's wrong with you?
Yes.
Like, are you angry? Are you sad? Uh,
What's
I
wrong?
The other image I have for this is going to I guess I go to doctors more now, going to a doctor's office or a hospital, like let's say to have blood taken, something like that. Um, I'm sitting in a waiting room, which may or not be empty. And where I live, they're usually empty, quite
Mm-hmm.
empty. And there's a television set on the ceiling, bolted into the ceiling. I don't understand that. That really is insane.
Mm-hmm.
And there it is.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do in that case then is I try to certainly avoid looking at this television set, but then to take in the emptiness of the space and the silence that is there and the waiting, because waiting is a kind of emptiness itself. And that's a theme I love to talk about. So there are all these different facets to being empty. It could be silence, it could be waiting, it could be uh, avoiding unnecessary sound. There's so many things, and you could be found, like you just find yourself in a place that's empty and you take it in and make use of it. So you can make an art of it. You can design your life to be empty. There are many things, many ways of going about this. And the more I talk about it, the more I realize that this is a vast topic.
You can write a whole book on.
I might.
Many books on. What I project onto this that, and I said I was working with a couple last night, and I tend to say something like, "Well, that seems scary." And the fella who's in the session, he's like, "You keep saying scary. I don't know that it's scary." And it's certainly my projection, but I don't think people are as connected with the scariness that does come up because we're so often filling the time,
Oh, yeah.
anxious and insecure. So I'm. You mentioned this term, at the beginning of your book of kenosis, and you're populating this image with waiting as rather than bringing up anxiety that has me looking at my phone in 2 seconds, that I'm actually luxuriating in the spaciousness. And why? Like, what do you say to somebody who's like, why in the world would I want to do that? I can get shit done here,
Well, if I understand what you're saying, I would say to somebody that the absence of hyperactivity or talking too much, all these different ways we fill up space, maybe from the anxiety
Yeah.
of having to be quiet, and then you become aware of things when you're quiet. You hear things that are not audible usually. You pay attention to things going through your mind, your imagination, and that can be upsetting for a lot of people. And I think that for many, being too busy, or talking too much is a way of keeping out all those other voices and messages that are going on all the time. So it's a kind of defense to fill it up.
Mm-hmm.
So the emptying, if you can just sit there in silence or without talking, that gives you a richer experience of life. You know yourself better. Um, you can probably make better decisions because you are in tune with yourself. There are many, many advantages of emptying out.
What I like about what you're saying is that what I guess the image that came to mind was how often we make decisions. People make decisions based on money, for example. So it's it's like if you're applying for a job and you've got three options, the way that you rank order them is based on how much money you're getting paid. But what I imagine you're getting at is that there might be other little voices that come up in the process that beckon you into different realities that aren't so beholden to that. Is that a fair example?
Oh, yes, that's a good
Yeah,
example. I was
yeah,
thinking when you said that in my case, I usually, for years now, I've had an auction for a new book that I want to publish. So in other words, several publishers will uh, gather together and bid on the book.
mm,
And I don't think in the past number of years, I can't remember the last time we went with the person who offered the most money. We're always looking for other things, but to pay attention to those things, you have to get away from the compulsion
mm.
of money and the thought that is sort of unconscious and in the air, that of course you should always choose the most money no matter what. But that's not that's really not the best value usually. So I think that's a good example that you just gave.
It reminds me of this scene in the Lord of the Rings when Gandalf they're in the caves down below, and they're trying to find the right direction, and nobody knows the way, so they all sit and they're waiting.
Yeah.
And finally he says, "Oh, it's that way." And somebody goes, "Well, how'd you find out? Did you just remember?" And he goes, "No, no, no, I smelled it."
Yeah.
And I always loved that for the like a different sense than we typically use. It's so often I remember or I see it, but to smell something out is kind of more of an instinctual urge.
Right. Exactly. Now, here's an example. I don't know if I put this in the book or not. Honestly, I can't remember. But Thoreau says that when we go for a walk, which is he thinks is the best thing we could do,
Mm.
you go for a walk. When you leave your house, you shouldn't decide where to walk. You should just walk. Just
Mm-hmm.
walk out of your house and walk, and
Mm-hmm.
don't think about where you're going. Just go. And that's a kind of emptying. It's an emptying out of control and too much thinking and so many other things you could associate with that.
There are, but my God, what what comes up is this idea of purpose, but it's not purposeful. I need to have a direction. You need to have a direction. We always hear
That's right.
that. uh,
You might imagine that I'm not a very good spokesperson for the purposeful life.
right. Well, then let's argue the opposite, because we hear about that a lot. This, what's your purpose? Critique that. Help me understand where you come from on this subject.
I think that well, let me start with this. I'm a musician, a composer. I've been doing that since I was in my teens, and and one of the things we do in music and writing music is to, in my case, let the performers make a lot of choices about what to do. So I might give them some suggestions on a musical score of what to do, but I don't spell it out. I may not give them the notes. I may not give them the timing of it. They have to choose that. But I have a design that they fit into, but they do a lot. So I think allowing life to happen is
Mm.
something I think is very, very important. Allowing life to happen. The Tao Te Ching says, let things take their course. I like that very much. So, and another aspect of it is that purpose, I think, has got to be equivalent in psychology to ego. It's got to be,
Mm-hmm.
captain tells you where to go and what you're going to do when you get there. But you don't need the captain. All you need to do is set out like in a boat and float on the water. There's a wonderful passage in Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he discusses, I think it's there, where he discusses Tristan and Isolde.
Mm-hmm.
Great old story, where Tristan is a young man who's in love with Isolde, who's in Ireland, and he's in England. And he sets out, he finds himself on a small boat, like a little sailboat, apparently. And he has no rudder and he has no way to control the boat at all. And so there he is. He's sailing to his love, but he has no way of getting there. He can't control the route. And Campbell says that in his wonderful commentary on that, he says that he's teaching us, that story is teaching us to surrender ourselves to the guidance of life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful thought, I think, and that goes against this idea of having a purpose. You might say that Isolde had a purpose, but he just had a love. He was compelled by love. And so the other thing is that in my work, I make a great deal of things like the muse, the angel, the daimon, these voices that guide us, or these presences that guide us, urges that might guide us.
Mm.
And you can't pay attention to those. You can't follow them if you're in charge. So a purpose there would get in the way.
I go to the. It's so contrary to what we would call ego psychology. You know, the
Oh yeah.
you know, our our modern our modern healing containers, which are just soaking in productivity and
Well, see,
purpose.
I think it's deeply religious because I think the essence of religion, well, there are a couple of essences, but one of them is that you trust. It's called faith. You know, it's an old word, faith. That you have faith in life itself and you let life direct you instead of having to be in charge and know where you're headed. I think that's a religious point of view rather than a secular one. And that's what I'm always trying to do as I'm trying to restore a religious attitude, because I think that's the best way to get soul into life is to
Mm-hmm.
act with a religious attitude rather than a secular one. Secular is almost identical at times anyway with ego.
Say more about that. That rang a bell.
Well, ego is about knowing what you're doing uh, and being in charge and
Mm.
taking responsibility. I think all those things are way overdone.
I agree.
So, I think it's a religious attitude to listen for the signs. I mean,
Mm.
before in ancient times, people would say, "Let the angel guide you." Well, we don't. Today, I don't speak of angels much, although I would love to have become an angelologist when at a certain point in my life, because people misunderstand. They think about beings who are physically in the air
Mm-hmm.
somewhere. I'm not. That's not how it is. It's that life itself has certain guidance in it, and we can picture that as a daimon, an angel, or muse, something like that. But it's a presence or it's an influence that you sense, and you don't have to say where it comes from. Don't get into that question. That's the bad question. Don't try to figure it out. Just say, okay, this happens. And some people have used their imagination and they've painted this thing, this presence, as an angel or something else if they told stories. And so to me, then, this is a very religious thing to do to let life happen and to adjust yourself and to read, especially read the signs that are going on.
I love the. I started learning Greek a bit, and the term angelo, you know, we get this the messenger, you know, and
Yes,
we've of course painted the face of that message with a messenger that's relatable, and then we've lost the ability to listen to these little whispers.
exactly. Little whispers. The people they whisper in your ear. They don't really do that, and you don't actually hear it so much as you are aware of a message.
Mm.
My friend James Hillman has a something on YouTube now, a talk that he gave where he studied under Jung a bit. He didn't have much to do with Jung, but some because Jung was quite old by the time that Hillman got to Zurich. But at any rate, he tells a story that he went to Jung's wake and he was in this room with Jung's body and maybe a couple other people in the room. And he stood there in the presence of Jung's body. And as he was leaving, he he says he came away knowing that he had now to go on with his own life,
Mm.
his own work, not Jung's, his own work. And he presented in such a way, he didn't say that this is what came to me. He really didn't say that. He didn't say this. He said, this is what I left with, indicating that he got this message in that situation mysteriously. It just, there's something about these things that come to us that are very certain. You can trust them. You have to use your intelligence with it, but you can trust them most of the time. And then for him, that was a very important message. And I thought that was a very good example of this kind of living where you you're quiet, like he was in this room quietly, and he got that message. It was so quiet that he didn't say it was a voice. He just said that he got the message, put it in the kind of a passive voice, and I think that's pretty good.
Hmm. I do too. What a different the busyness, the if anything, given how filled up we are all the time with how accessible we are, the to create moments of quiet. I talk to a lot of people who one of the recommendations I make is to drive in their car without music on. And I'm like you, I'm a musician. And so it's kind of an odd thing to say in a time where you can connect with music so much, but just to listen and be silent and respond and have a practice of getting from here to there without having to be on your phone or listen to tunes. And people look at me like I'm a little crazy when I say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad.
Yeah, well, it is crazy in a certain sense. It's what they call Platonic madness. Platonic madness is a good thing. Plato talked about different ways we have to be creatively out of our minds. And
Mm.
that's what I would call it, a Platonic madness. That means you need to get into this. That's a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, it is. Um, so before we get into this idea further of a Western practice of emptiness, a thought comes to mind about AA. I've really been thinking a lot about AA and the way that those principles function. And one of the beautiful things about these steps that are principles by which somebody can live their life is that they first have to recognize that there's a problem. Like, I got a problem. There's a problem with the way I live my life, choices that I make. And then there's a seeking out of a higher power. And that scares that's always a lot of problem for people because they imagine a big guy in the sky with a beard. And what I like about what you're saying that I think clicks into this is no, the higher power is that you're emptying out and saying I'm receptive. I'm receptive to some kind of new way of being or new source of relationship with my inner life, and then I live out all the rest of these principles and kind of have a broader existence. So we've been doing this on some level. I just think our image of the higher power is problematic. Would would you? Because you talk about this in the book that there are practices of emptying one's understanding of God, and so can we get into this and talk about because that from a Christian perspective especially that doesn't make much sense.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me.
I know it does.
Uh, okay, we have an idea of God. If you read the theologians, the ancient theologians like Thomas Aquinas and others around him, um, they describe God as ineffable. That means you can't really talk about God. Once you speak, you've made a mistake. You're
Mm.
saying the wrong thing. It's like the Tao Te Ching says, that he who knows does not speak. Um, and it's a very common thing. You don't, for in the Jewish tradition, you don't speak, you use the name of God. Um, there's a reason for that, and very good reason when you think about it, because when a lot of people today have used the name God, usually they end up in fights because somebody else doesn't have the same idea they have, the same definitions and way of talking about it. And so it's been very, very bad in human history for people to use the word God, I think. Been a big problem. So
Mm.
you have to empty that out somehow. How do you empty it? Well, I give a talk sometimes that I say, I rarely use the name God. That's how I put it. Once in a while I do, but very rarely, very, very rarely. I think that's a pretty good suggestion because you don't have to put an interdict or rule about it, but you can say, be cautious and don't use that word too often unless you really are at a point where when you use that word, you evoke the infinite, the ineffable, the invisible. the that which can't be understood. If you can evoke all that in the way you use the word God, fine. But if you can't, then you're filling it in with something.
Hmm.
Because if there's anything that is empty, it is God. That means because we can't understand what we're talking about there. Anyone who says they do understand it, I wouldn't trust very much because
Hmm.
by definition, you can't understand God. And if you get to that point in your understanding of God that way, I think that you begin to live a religious life. You are open to the mysteries around us. You're open to indications of what to do with your life. Um, all these things become available. So to me, the emptying out of God is one of the most important things in our society that we could do.
Well, is it okay to translate that by saying you're creating a practice that recognizes the inevitability of assumptions and preconditions and expectations, but your practice is to let those, um, leak out. I think to use
Yeah,
your
yeah,
term,
that's it.
let it leak out and not become so fixed, and so that you're more of a receptive vessel for that which can't be spoken, as opposed to the possessor of some specialized knowledge or relationship. Fair to say?
Absolutely, yes. I would never trust a teacher who says he knows entirely what he's talking about. I don't care what it is he's talking about or she. So we have to empty that our own certainties, and we have to empty our favorite language
Mm.
for important things.
Mm-hmm.
We have to empty our the feeling that we are special, that we
Mm.
have a special place, therefore we know things. I think you have to empty so much. And that's great because it's an ongoing process and you have to do it every day. And when you do that, you'll find that life becomes much richer and you understand things at a much deeper level.
Mm. I, I have that in my experience, and there is this tendency for us to grasp, and so I think having an idea like emptiness is positing that we have a tendency to grasp, and so our practice is a release. Like you're going to, would it be fair to say that your ego or your existence is going to grasp, to possess and hold, and so the spiritual practice of emptying is somewhat compensatory for this inevitability?
At times it is, yes, I would say. Definitely is. It's at times a way of responding to, yeah, I think people have these urges and needs, need to understand things that are not understandable, need to have language that is really clear when things are not clear, and a need to have a teacher who knows everything when nobody knows everything. So, yeah, there's a kind
Mm-hmm.
of reaction, maybe a response to the tendency that we all have. I think we all have it with us to right away look for an explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So if I use the word angel, I'm sure many people are going to say, "Do you mean angels really exist?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I do, but I don't at the same time. Maybe not exist in the same way you're thinking. As we talk now, I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I think I did quote him in the
Mm-hmm.
book,
Mm-hmm.
and he was put in prison for being involved in a plot against Hitler, and he was a minister in Germany, and he wrote letters to to a friend of his from prison when he was put in prison for, I think it was about 2 years he was in prison, but to be hanged eventually.
Mm.
And he wrote these letters, and one of the things he said was that he said, "I'm a pastor. I'm a Christian pastor, and I feel uncomfortable when people use the word God." He said, "How can that be? I'm the pastor." But he said, "It's what they mean by it, what I mean by it are two different things." And he said there that we should live in those letters. He said we should live as though God were not given. That's the word he uses, given, not given, in the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bit of a paraphrase, but that's pretty
But
close to what he said.
it's such a it's such a practice, to it's not a belief. It seems like a practice. You have the nature of the way in which this organism being functions, and I have this practice that can allow for me to receive. And that I heard that a while ago, that my friend who's a priest, James Durkitz, he was talking about moving from orthodoxy to orthopraxis, and I've always loved that so much.
Uh,
It's different than just coming together and doing the social obligation of participating in the ritual and thinking, okay, I did that. The
yeah,
praxis. And
yeah.
this, to me, your book seems like it's providing a framework for this praxis. Uh, um, so let's link this up in a kind of Christian approach, because we talked about it before years ago. So I want to just tip the hat for a moment, because something you said earlier that seems like it stands out is that you went to seminary at 13, which which is a story I've always loved. And so I want to ask you a Jesus question, and of course, what moved you into seminary at 13, and what predisposes a child to be interested in living an empty life of the monastic world?
Well, the only way I can understand it is that it's really hard to talk about because I could easily be misunderstood.
Mm.
But I can understand it as my leaving my family, whom I loved very, very much. I had a wonderful mother and father and brother, and then grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts, and very big and warm, supportive family. And I loved it. And leaving that was like, I can't describe how painful it was. And I still feel homesick today from that. I still wish
I
didn't
bet.
have to do that. But I did it because I was so overwhelmed with desire
Mm.
for life, I think, in some way. And I think what that did for me was to put me in the direction of where I am today. I mean, I'm just saying where I am today, but what I mean by that is that this is the way my life has turned out. And to me, it's a meaningful life. And if I had stayed in the family, I can't imagine how I could have been here at this point. Leaving home at that time, early on, really allowed me to deeply get interested in these things that you and I are talking about today. And to be able to, I see my life work as trying to take the wonderful traditions all around the world for these mysteries and present them in a way that people can relate to. Maybe not fully understand, but at least relate to and take on in some way. And I think that's what happened. At 13, I left so that I could do this work. I don't think that, there was a hand guiding me or, something in the sky guiding me, but I don't know. It could be. It could be a flying saucer, as far as I'm concerned. It could be so many things.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do know is that I was guided and the only way I could have left home would have been a tremendous desire to move on somehow because my attachment to my family was so great. The only way it could have been done. And I think that's what happened to me.
Mm. That must have been. I just project onto your folks, how How the challenging that would have been. It's amazing that they allowed that to happen.
Yes, my mother objected. She tried to persuade me not to do it. And it was really hard for me because I love my mother so much and it was so hard to do that. But I'm just saying that my desire was so strong that I was able to stay with it.
Wow. So, as you moved into seminary, away from your family of birth into your spiritual family, this I'm curious about how, because that's got to be wild. I mean, to be in a monastery and learning a tradition in a way that doesn't concretize it so much. I'm projecting onto the seminary because the seminarians I've known have a pretty evolved theology. These tend to be pretty brilliant folks that use language like this, like have an evolved understanding that at times feels a little more Eastern than it does Western. That monastic life. So this, oddly enough, I'm on question 2 in our interview today, Thomas. So, in what ways can the teachings of Jesus about self-emptying be applied to in our personal lives and relationships and careers? Because I think we misunderstand this image of Christ.
It seems to me that Jesus is a figure who addresses our day-to-day living. I love the fact that the first story told in the Gospel of John is about his attending a wedding party. How many spiritual leaders would be presented that way? I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's the way the Buddha is shown, being at a wedding party, making wine. I don't think so. I don't think most people would expect that. And yet that's what we get. And so I think we should take that seriously, that this following, what follows in that gospel, we've got the first story. Now, what follows is all related to that opening story, which means that this is all about living a life of pleasure and joy and community and celebration and marriage. Uh, that this is all human, very, very human. And that's what he's coming to do to make it happen. So in this case, he makes wine. That's pretty important at a wedding party, I guess, in certain places anyway. And so that puts it in the realm, I would say, that makes his whole philosophy Epicurean, which I like to say that because Epicurus was a philosopher who taught that pleasure is the main principle in life.
Mm.
Not hedonism, not entertainment and overdoing it, but just the opposite. He said like modest pleasure, like friendship, is one of the pleasures that is so important in life. And yes, eating, dining with friends is part of it too. And that's what Jesus did. I mean, he not only went to the wedding party, after that, he's at one dinner after another and he's cooking food. And eating is really one of the big parts of the activities of the Gospels. There's a whole book written about Jesus and eating in the Gospels. So I think that if we start with that, we can understand we're not talking about some austere, remote spirituality. In some ways, Jesus, I would say he was not a spiritual teacher at all. He was a soul teacher. Soul meaning closer to life and deep in the heart and about relationships and home and family and pleasure and fun and play. That's all soul stuff. I think he was more of a soul teacher than a spiritual teacher. He definitely had some spirit in there, no question about that, but I don't think it's the main thing if you read those stories closely.
Say more about the difference.
Of what spirit and
Spirit and soul. Yeah.
well, soul is, as I understand it, is what makes us. This is what the old ancient teachers taught. They said soul is what makes us human, and it's what connects a body and spirit, and it's really in the mid realm. That's not too far from the Buddha's teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the mid realm, and it's not high up there. It's not extreme into the spirit. Yes, there's some spirituality. There has to be. Soul always has some spirituality involved, but it is at the same time tethered, you might say, to daily life and to the ordinary aspects of life that have to do with what we call it psyche today, and but psyche really is the Greek word for soul. So it's about the soul. So it's the difference between psychology and spirituality. The soul would be more in the psychological sphere, probably. Although, as I said, spirit always has something to do with it. This is an old teaching of the soul being lower. I could show you uh, from hundreds of years ago maps of soul and spirit, and it shows the spirit with angels in the sphere of the angels, and it shows the soul in the spirit of the planets, in the sphere of the planets, which influence life, which are guiding life, speaking astrologically. So
Is this a Gnostic reference?
no, it's not. That idea comes out of Robert Flood, who was
Mm.
a magus in the 17th century in England. But he's picking up on an old tradition. You can find these images in very old manuscripts as well, much older than that. But they're very
Oh,
clear in Flood.
yeah, I'm gonna go looking.
Yeah, you go look. They're wonderful. If you look at it, just see it as a map of how we're put together and he has all these divisions. So you have all the different choirs of angels at the top, and then you've got the planets in the middle. At the very bottom, you have the human body. It's I think that's that kind of thing. It's called Neoplatonic, if you want to
Mm-hmm.
name for it. It's a Neoplatonic view of life that many people over the centuries have picked up and made their own in their own ways. I like particularly Robert Flood's charts that he makes and images that he makes for this whole thing, and it makes it very clear that soul is related to life, daily life. Like I said, home, family, play, things like that.
Well, and
And
sorry, keep going.
so, no, spirit is different. Spirit is equally valuable, but it takes us beyond humanity, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Soul gives us our humanity. The spirit takes us beyond to transcend our humanity, which is a very valuable thing.
That's great, Thomas. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna follow that yellow brick road. Uh, as you're talking about Jesus and pleasure, you of course made this reference, and a friend of mine, Brian Marescu, made this reference in his work. You know, many before us have made this reference about Dionysus and Christ, and it's interesting that in the tradition of when you read the Greek tradition, Dionysus it's much more obvious the pleasure principle that's being connected there. We lose it a little bit. It's a little more hidden with Christ. Would you talk about this connection between Dionysus and Christ?
It's usually made in reference to the story of the Cana that I was referring to, the
Yes.
wedding feast at Cana. That's where they usually talk about Jesus. Of course, it's also there in the Last Supper when Jesus says that this is my blood.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is my blood. That's pretty Dionysian. You can't escape that. So it's there. And the connection is, when it comes to sacred texts or almost any imaginative texts, you have to pay close attention to images. They may only be briefly present, then they go off. Other things happen, but you pay attention to any image that is present is going to be strong in influencing the message of the text. So if you have Jesus making wine and then saying this, you know, this wine is my blood, that's plenty to see that he has a strong Dionysian side.
Mm.
And what does that mean? Dionysus was a Greek god who was in his story as a child, as an infant, was torn apart by the Titans, torn apart. And Jesus, they relate that to Jesus being on the cross, that his body was just racked, in that image of him being torn apart. And So there is the Dionysian element as well. And among the Greeks, then, Dionysus, because that torn apart refers to your mind as well. That, like when you drink wine, you can lose your control, lose a sense. You say and do things that you wouldn't say if you weren't drinking wine. And that can be seen as a metaphor or an extended saying that this is any kind of uh, situation where your mind is not fully at work, where it is kind of ripped apart. That could be Dionysian. And what that does, it offers an intensity of life at the same time as it offers death. So with
Mm.
Dionysus, you see death and life being almost overlapping with each other. And there's a kind of dying that goes on in finding new life. Of course, that's the whole story of Jesus and Dionysus as well. And the main source for Dionysus, do you want me to go on?
Please, I love this stuff. Yes.
The main source of Dionysus is a play by Euripides called Bacchae, called the
Yeah.
Bacchae. Bacchus was a name for Dionysus, or for a god very closely related to Dionysus, a god of the wine, of wine. And in this play of Euripides, there's a man, Pentheus, who is the ruler of a city, and Dionysus comes to his city and calls people together into a sort of wild ritual outside the
Hmm.
city. And Pentheus says, I can't allow this. This is destroying our civilization. So Pentheus sort of represents this resistance to the Dionysian. And other people in the play go out to join Dionysus, and they take part in the ritual, and they really become they kind of lose their mind and lose control. And I think that's what this play is so important to show us what that's all about and how we naturally, a Pentheus in us resists the Dionysian as
Yeah.
well.
I'm actually currently reading it, and it's taking me a while. I'm kind of meandering through that Euripides, and it brings up they call it the Bacchic yell, or the
Yeah,
expression, But the thing that stands out about that play at the beginning is this: when they're going out to do these ceremonies, they're talking about being cleansed by the gods.
right.
And Peter Kingsley talks about this, that um, we we oftentimes are asking God, or the gods, for something, whether it be a parking place or a whatever. And he makes this really beautiful in Catafalque. He makes this beautiful framework at the very beginning, saying we're not asking how to be of service to the gods. And I think, again, this empty me and allow me to be a vessel is a totally different orientation than the Christianity that I grew up in. And it's one of the reasons I get so excited about reading this Greek material, and certainly what makes me so excited about Euripides.
Well, I think that it's a very good idea I always say, if you're going to read Carl Jung, read him through Hillman, read Hillman at the same time. And if you're going to study Christianity, study the Greeks
Yeah.
at the same time, because you will find very useful parallels and it will keep you from becoming too literal. It'll empty out that tendency to make this your only point of view.
Okay. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to dive into the Hillman Jung dynamic. Would you speak more about that? Because I notice in Jungian circles, that's kind of one of my traditions, and many folks will critique Hillman because, and here's the typical criticism, is that he's a deconstructionist. Just kind of rips everything apart and lays it bare on the floor. So, what's your take on this dynamic between Hillman and Jung?
You know, you have to know that he and I were very close friends for 38 years.
Yes.
And I was I was very, very attached to his way of thinking from before he published any books. And he and I were buddies, and both of us, we would go out to speak together. And very often we got treated badly because those attitudes toward his work. I never had that myself.
Yeah.
I find him, I do, he was someone who pointed out what he thought were weaknesses in
Yeah.
things. He didn't treat people easily. He wanted to challenge everyone,
Mm-hmm.
get them to think, for one thing. And so there's that in him. But knowing him so well, I never ever felt that he was uh, approaching anything negatively or destructively
Yeah.
or even deconstructively. And uh, and I think what he gives us is tremendously solid and useful and good guidance. All of his books do that. And I think his greatest gift was that you give him anything at all to talk about, and he would start talking in ways you never thought of.
Wow.
He just had a whole new, fresh imagination of everything. You never, you're sitting there waiting, oh, the usual kind of language and ideas. You wouldn't get them because first of all, he would never take a question or a topic on its own terms. He would always make it his own. And then he would explore it in ways that were so imaginative and yet rooted in tradition and solid. He'd
Mm-hmm.
argue he'd give you a very good argument for everything he
I'm
said.
sure.
And today it bothers me a little bit because today people are criticizing him right and left, and I would give anything, including Peter, by the way, who's also a friend of mine, Peter Kingsley.
Yeah.
If you are arguing and trying to take him down today, and he's not here to defend
Yeah.
himself. No, he'd be there putting his gloves on, ready to get into the fight.
You get that sense from him. I've read a lot of Hillman, and I, I'm, I find myself enjoying his work. I struggle with it. Like I struggle as I get into it, and but I guess you've given me a gift by saying that if you're going to read Jung, you need to also read Hillman because it does keep you from falling into this more concretistic grasping. This, as even Jung said, I'm not a Jungian, and it seems like what you're saying is to integrate both Hillman's perspective and Jung's perspective can prevent that. It's a bit of a fundamentalist framework, to fall into that fundamentalism.
Totally, yeah. I always tell people that I never became a Jungian because I was a Catholic and I don't want another pope. I mean, that's just
It's true.
there's a tendency to big papa, a big
Yeah,
father
yeah.
figure. Now, a good example of what you're talking about is Hillman's book Anima. He wrote a book called
Mm-hmm.
Anima, which is on one page. As you look at it, the left page are all quotes from Jung, and the right page is all passages from Hillman. And done with great respect. He's not there to tear Jung down at all. He's there to say, well, I think this is fantastic, but this other thing here just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And he explores those things. For example, I might as well give an example. So he says
Please.
in the book, he says that he quotes Jung saying that the anima is the unconscious life of a man, and that's probably there because women are able to live out and articulate their anima, and men aren't. And Hillman then comes in and says, well, I don't like this gender
Mm.
limitation on anima and animus. He said, why don't we just make it open to everybody and realize that we all have to deal with and relate to anima and animus in ourselves, and that gender issue is probably out of date at this point. So, to me, that's very convincing, and that was
Agreed.
liberating to me to be
Yeah.
able to talk about the anime without all the gender talk.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm glad you said that because it's what I find myself teaching in the first place. The limit, we had this idea of the contrasexual position in the original Jungian framework, but then looking at it as an energetic movement, that I think that's much more healthy, and we certainly can disregard the the energy and then the gender and then the sex dynamic that ends up combining together and creating an awful lot of confusion for people.
A lot of confusion and yeah, and biases and all kinds of problems. But you have to remember that Hillman wrote that book quite early. I don't remember the date of that one, but it
Mm.
must have been 1980 something. And and saying that at that time was not as easy to do as it is
Mm-hmm.
today. So he did get a lot of criticism, I think, at that time, and I think there's much more openness today.
Mm-hmm. How did care of the soul impact or influence your relationship with him?
I don't know. I have to ask him. I really don't know. We talked about it a little bit. Uh, he told me once, one thing that's related to it. He told me once, he said, "Look, you're doing a lot of writing," and he said it's really said you're going in a good direction yourself. And he said, "Would you please stop quoting me all over the place?" He said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "Just write the ideas.
That's beautiful.
He said, "We share these ideas." So that's the basis for me to feeling that he was fine. And he gave me a beautiful endorsement on that
Mm-hmm.
book. And he said that Care of the Soul would last longer than psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
pretty good. He was usually pretty reticent. So I took that comment pretty seriously. I
I
felt that
bet you did.
yeah. So, and then we just had a good time ever after. We would get together and laugh most of the time. We laugh about everything. The most serious things we would, and he had a big laugh, and both of us just laughed about things, and we enjoyed that. So, but then the New York Times came out with an article saying that the New York Times Magazine
Mm.
saying that I had stolen everything from Hillman and made money on it, and he didn't.
Mm.
So that was a problem we had to deal with, and we talked about it a lot and resolved that. He and I had never been at odds about any of that stuff. We used to go shopping together. That's the way we enjoyed doing. We were not we were not there battling each other on the plane of ideas. We were enjoying life and having fun and playing with ideas a lot,
Mm-hmm.
sharing most of it. The only part that where he and I differed was in the realm of spirituality. He used to call me, he said, "You're a monk." And he would say it with disdain. He hated that. And I just took it as fun, because but I knew that he also didn't like he used to always refer to Christianism instead of Christianity. And I thought that was really, really bad taste.
Well,
Uh,
is that because the he my projection onto Hillman is this again? I use the term to deconstruct is to almost do what we're talking about doing, like to try to prevent the congealing that can tend to happen. And so my
yeah,
immediate projection onto that is that when you become an ism or you align yourself with a tradition, you renounce certain emptiness. Is that
yes. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
yeah?
And I'm sure that's what he intended.
That's fun to hear, Thomas. Thanks for that. This side road we've gone on about your relationship with him. Powerful figure. I've got most of his books,
Yeah,
but challenging. Like I read Emotion, his book called Emotion, that I really liked. Oddly enough, I'd never stumbled onto anybody who really took that subject on, and I was glad he did.
absolutely, yes. That was kind of the origin. I think that was his first publication.
Yeah, it was good. So I want to jump back into something that we share, which is music.
Hmm.
And in your book, you talk about speaking of emptiness, a stringless lute. And so
Yeah.
I'm interested in this idea of how music has influenced your understanding of spirituality and soul and emptiness. Could you speak about that?
It's difficult to articulate. It's there for sure, but I find it difficult to articulate. One of the things I can tell you more experientially is that I'm a classical musician, and for the most part, and I find myself most mornings going to the piano and deciding what to play on the piano. And then I go to write. I try to go directly from the piano to my computer to write because I want to bring that spirit that I have found in one of these composers to my work and my writing. So uh, that's one way in which music has affected me directly, practically. And when I reflect on it, I think that, for example, I like to, well, any good composer I play. Let's say I play a lot of Bach, J.S. Bach, and fugues and things like that he wrote. And I think what he did was he's very intellectual. He set up a problem in music, like with three notes. It's oral, it's all the art, but still it's kind of intellectual at the same time. So you set up these three notes. And they probably have some reference to some idea or theology or something. He always had references like
Yeah.
that. And one of his biographers even says that he had, the paintings of him show him with six buttons on his shirt, referring to certain pattern of notes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Everything had meaning.
Hmm.
But he set up a problem in music. He wanted to write a fugue on this. He wanted to, maybe he wanted and I could show you this in one piece of his. He wanted these three notes to be the composition and no others, just those three. And let's say a 3 minute piano piece.
Mm-hmm.
Only those three notes. Now, moved around, moved upside down, extended, put in different keys, all of that, but still the same three notes all the way through. There's a piece of his that I know, one of his fugues, that has this three notes and nothing else except maybe a couple fillers here and there, just to like an ending or something like that. So he's doing that and he's trying to work out. So I have, I'm playing it and I know this is what's happening as I play. I see that he has taken these three notes and he has turned them upside down now. And now he has made them stretch out to be very long notes. And now he's repeating them over and over again. And he's doing all these things. And I'm thinking this as I play it because I've studied this stuff and I'm interested in it. And then I go to write my book and I'm thinking, well, I need some economy. That's called musical economy, compositional economy, meaning you don't waste a lot of notes. You just use three notes. And so when I'm writing a book, I may want that book to be economical
Hmm.
in that artistic sense. I don't want to have all kinds of no ideas coming out all over the place. I don't want to start new things always. I want to take something and work it like a fugue, where I'm going to be doing maybe some ideas from a different angle and turning them around so that I can explore them. I'm thinking musically as I go.
Hmm. That is helpful. You write music, yes?
Yes.
Do you produce it? Is it available?
Trying to think. I have I haven't written any music for a performance in quite a while. Like some of my choral music was performed by the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra and their choral. Um, and Michigan State University did some performances, and I've had things like that, but I've never made a thing of it. No, I mean, I stopped being a composer. When I went to the University of Michigan to study, and it was a very good school. And when I finished, I thought, this is not me. I can't go as far in this as I would need to
Mm-hmm.
for my nine needs of success and what I do. So I let it go and I focused then on, I got a degree in religious studies and went from there. So it's not that I have abandoned music, but I haven't followed up on it, like making it a career in any way.
But you play daily.
I do. I play almost every day. Yeah,
Would you consider that a spiritual practice?
I would. Yeah, definitely. No question.
Absolutely. I
Mhm.
agree. I'm jealous of the piano. I'm a guitarist,
Yeah.
and I play in a band with a classically trained pianist,
Oh,
and I get to I get to be on the proverbial stage with a fella that I would pay to see play music, or to
oh yeah.
listen. And it's such he's revolutionizing my understanding of music because I come from I am not theory. I don't understand theory. I we would call that in the studio. We would call that I'm an ear. I learn by ear. I
Right.
mean, I took lessons, but I don't read music, and
I
so
get
it's
it.
very much intuitive. And and then there's this mentality of like following the notes and learning the theory and I just never did that. And so I ended up playing in like honky tonks and rock venues and not not a symphony.
Well, I envy that because my daughter is a very successful musician,
Hmm.
and she's an ear. She plays by ear, and I tried to teach her all my
She
theory.
won.
She was young, but she didn't want anything to do with it. And then she was being influenced by friends of mine who were musicians who didn't want like reading notes either. But I admire it and respect it a great deal. And most of I have so many friends who play music by ear, and what they are doing, what my daughter does in her compositions, to me is absolutely amazing.
Wow.
Very, what I would consider very high level music. But she's not. She doesn't know the theory very much.
Mm-hmm.
But I love theory, and I love being able to play a piece and know what's going on.
Yeah, it's something typological there. It's very interesting. Whatever that is, I I I think I've probably learned how to read music twice in my life, but I don't I don't recall it. And now my new instrument is the flute. I play this native wind
Oh
six hole
yeah,
flute, which I to
beautiful.
me that's more of a meditation. I play the flute and the drum, and it's totally meditative. Body beautiful because the guitar seems kind of different. So I want to jump ship from our conversation about music and get into marriage. You offer this idea. It's a different spiritual practice.
Yeah.
You offer this idea of an empty marriage, and
Mhm.
I would you speak to that a little bit? Let's talk about kind of romantic relationship and marriage. Well, I want to propose this idea that in relationship, when you're with somebody, to like my motivation there is actually to plant this seed for folks about being in relationship with another human without these kinds of expectations, without the ideas of who they are, who I need them to be, and how these concepts of emptiness might play out in relationship to other people. So that's really what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah,
If we can
I
just,
get it. Yeah. Well, yes, there are so many ways in which emptiness could be very useful in working on relationships. For one, I'm just thinking of a therapy hour I did this morning, um, where one person in the marriage feels they have to really make the other person do things correctly, or to you know even
mm-hmm.
if it means expressing their feelings, or whatever no matter what it is, no matter how good the idea might be. I do think marriage calls for a lot of emptiness, where you allow things to happen, allow the other person to have his or her own life. And that's not easy, because there's something about marriage that brings along with it, quite unconsciously, perhaps culturally, I'm not really sure, the idea that now I own this person, or that I'm in charge now, or that he or she has to do what I expect and want.
Mm-hmm.
All that's got to be emptied so that the other person can have a rich, full life without your interference. That doesn't mean without your participation and engagement, you know,
Mm-hmm.
totally. But there's a difference between being fully engaged and needing to have that person be the person that you expect and want and think is best. I think that it's like children. It's very similar to children. That has to be empty too for parents
Mm-hmm.
allow the child to become who they are, not who you want them to be.
Oh,
That's
that's tough.
yeah, that's empty. That's emptying the parent role, and it's emptying in the very positive sense because it allows the parenting to take place without all of that controlling stuff.
Oh, God, that brings up something for me, I guess, that just the anxiety around um, how 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 possessed and possessive so much of our parenting is that we cling to it and as opposed to I got a friend of mine who wrote a book called The Conscious Parent, Shefali Sabari, and she talks about that so much of our parenting is playing out our own adaptive and maladaptive patterns from our development and then clinging to that and projecting those expectations onto others. That certainly brings up a lot about because I then immediately go into how in the world do you do that? How would you propose being an empty parent?
Well, there's if I can speak about Hillman once more,
Sure.
I think there's a close relationship between traditions of emptiness, like in Zen Buddhism, and Hillman's work. In fact, he had frequently I'd go to his house and he'd have some Japanese Buddhists visiting him, and I think that really showed that his work is very consistent with emptiness, and in this sense, that for the parents, see the way he and I would look at the parent-child thing is really look at the archetypal child and therefore empty our notion of child of its literalness and its actualness. And to realize, and Jung does this too in his essay on the child, which is a
Mm.
remarkable thing. In his essay on the archetype of the child, long essay of Jung, he says that I'm not talking about real children. I'm talking here
Mm.
about like what happens when in your life you're beginning something. Suddenly the child will appear in your dream or might appear in your fantasy and the
Mm.
way you feel. So it's an archetypal child, an archetypal parent that we really, really have to get to if we want to touch what's important and not talk about how to manage parents and all that kind of thing. It's too literal.
If I could, I want to share a dream that just came up that I happen to be engaging in some new developments in my life. And I had this dream a few weeks ago that it was very quick. There was a little boy who was probably 5 and he was talking to me and asking me for help. And then this huge figure, probably 8 foot tall black man genie. He's a massive genie with this big hood. He takes his hand and doesn't push me out of the way, but moves me out of the way like this. And I just remember the sensation of his arm. It was so strong. And he wasn't, again, it was, the sensation of it was fascinating because he wasn't getting me like that. It was, he moved me there and held me there. And then he started talking to the child. Dream ends.
Mm-hmm.
And I took that as such a powerful image for where I'm heading with this endeavor. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you not to ask you to interpret my dream, but I'm wondering in this context if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure, it seems to be pretty clear that way that when we are doing a project uh, and we really want it to succeed, you have to if you can only tune in to this imaginal archetypal level to realize that this project is not going to succeed if you do it. It's not going to work. What you have to do is elicit, conjure up, invite in the real powers. In other words, the real producer, the real maker, who is big and tough like your dream figure would be.
Mm-hmm.
He's a lot stronger than you are. You're pretty small in comparison to that. And it's like for me writing a book. If I felt I had to write my books, I'd never have anything done. I do everything to evoke a
Yeah.
spirit come in and do the work. And I'll pay them when they finish. It's like, and
Do you?
it's you can feel that, you can sense that, you can actually sense the presence of some other maker, doer, creator,
Hmm.
and it's your job to make sure that they're welcome and that you're willing to get out of the way, which is an emptiness phrase, get out
Yeah.
of the and let the figures do their work.
Thank you for honoring that dream in that way. Um, I, this is a dream. It's one of the dreams that I'll carry with me for probably my whole life. It felt so potent, and just the felt sense of being stiff armed by this magical figure that I was glad to be introduced to each of these individuals.
Well, you know that we could talk about that dream for hours.
Yeah.
There's so much, even though it's short,
Yep.
there's so much in it. So I don't mean to say, "Oh, that's easy. This is what that means." What I mean to say is that it does speak to our question, the question we were looking at,
That's right.
but it says a lot more as well.
Mm-hmm. It does. And what's interesting about the dream to come up in our conversation is this. When I was working over the dream initially, I wouldn't have been talking about emptiness. I certainly would have said, get out of the way. But now that I'm bringing all this together, it does make a lot of sense from this perspective that you're writing about of silence and emptiness. And I really appreciate this framework because I'll continue to take that with me and,
Oh, good.
and hold
This,
it
yeah,
more.
this is just a window, a prism, a filter, something that you look through in order to see things. But there are hundreds of other filters too, like even for your dream. One filter might be to see that you need to empty here so that that greater power can come in and do its job.
Mm-hmm.
But, we might look at it through a different filter and find something else. So we have to, that's what I mean. I don't mean to, if I were to say this is what this means, I'd be betraying the very
Right.
theme of my book.
Well, and I like that because what I like is the old religious. Well, in my dissertation, a lot of tangents. In my dissertation, I wrote primarily about four different interpretive lenses upon reality, but in particular, I was looking at scripture, and and I don't think a lot of people get that in their theological or religious training to recognize that when we're looking at something like a dream or a myth or scripture, that we need to bat it around in a way that doesn't let it become some fixed this is that. And so to broaden this a little bit, even apply it to our religious texts, the praxis of, hey, this could mean that, and that could mean that, and maybe that, and what if it's that? And then there's door number 8, which is nobody knows.
That's right. Absolutely. So, I think that this is rare in our society because many of the things we're talking about here are not out there.
Yeah.
They're not being practiced out there in our world. And I think what we do, many people do today is, and I do at times too, anyone might, you unconsciously absorb the culture's point of view and assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to artfully and consciously break away from those habits. And I think with this theme of emptiness, it really requires breaking away, being odd, being an eccentric to be able to do it.
Thank you for the permission I've been looking for my entire life to be as weird as I want to be.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, so being mindful of our time, and I'm so honored by your generosity. I want to take us from a kind of the wild world of emptiness and get a little practical just for folks listening. I am interested in your practical steps that somebody can take in order to cultivate this praxis of real emptiness, like being able to be in that space. What would you say to that?
I think you can practice this every day. Uh, well, one thing we didn't talk about emptiness to me is very interesting is how emptiness might be experienced as loss. That
Mm.
we lose things. We lose people, we lose objects, we lose jobs, friends, uh, parents. So life takes away. It's what the Greeks called Hermes. Life takes away, steals things from us, takes things from us.
Mm.
That is an emptying process. So one way of cultivating emptiness practically is when you do have a loss of some kind, and they can come, I think probably once a day. Something you're going to lose something, uh, and if you could hold that and be with it and see that there might be some value in this thing that you've lost. You might lose your keys, who knows? You might
Mm-hmm.
lose
Mm-hmm.
some kitchen thing that you've had forever and it suddenly broke or a glass breaks on the floor. That is an opportunity to develop your approach to life that includes emptiness. Because what you do then is you don't blame anyone for it because Hermes did it. You don't blame anyone, and you don't uh, determine that that's never going to happen again because you hope it happens again. It's part of life, very important part of life to be taken from, and you don't explain it. Well, this must have happened because I haven't been focusing lately. No, don't go into those explanations, those mundane explanations, ever. Whenever I hear people say them, I chew them out. I really go after them for doing that. So the last thing you want to do in life is offer a practical explanation for something mysterious.
Mm.
So that that is one way to bring emptiness into your daily life. When something empty happens, make something of it. Be with it. Someone doesn't show up when they say they're going to be present. Like for you, your client doesn't show up. I know what that's like.
Yep.
Client doesn't show up. This is the work of Hermes. Hermes is an important figure and has usually, maybe always, something to give. But his manner, his method is emptiness. So that's I think that would be a good thing, everyday practice. You can do it intentionally as well by you can empty quite literally by emptying out your house somewhat, emptying out your pockets, uh, emptying so many things that because everything is an image and evokes even unconsciously some deeper kind of emptying.
That's beautiful, Thomas. Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Um, it brought up some of these questions as I'm kind of contemplating closing our time today, and I've got two questions. The first is your your thoughts. From a religious lens. You may not know. You may know plenty, but certainly what's happening in the clinical world and the religious world of psychedelics. This orientation for kind of these religious experiences that people are having. And I'm wondering if you feel up to commenting on that. And also, the second question would be, what else have we not talked about today that we need to discuss?
Um, I'm not a good person to talk about psychedelics and use of drugs. I've um, in that respect, I'm really not a good person because I've never really been too interested in that, and I should, I suppose. I have had a couple clients who were involved in some work that like drugs for a spiritual purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the examples, the experiences I've had vicariously that way have not been good ones. I would not have a positive feeling about it. On the other hand, I do know, I trust the traditions, and the traditions do use drugs. There's even some interesting books written about Jesus being a mushroom
Yeah.
person.
I've read those.
Yeah. Uh, but I shouldn't even waste our time because I don't have any good thoughts about
That's
it.
okay. I was lobbing it out there just to see if you had any
But
thoughts.
I don't.
Thank you. So, what else do we need to include? What threads are left hanging out that we need to get into that you like to get into often?
Well, I think one thing that is important to me is it came up a little bit indirectly earlier. If you read my book, and I have to refer to the book, The Eloquence of Silence, it consists of a number of stories and some passages from thoughts of important leaders, and my reflections on it. If you read that book and look at, there are 30 stories in it, or passages, and you will find that a lot of them, I hope you find that they're humorous.
Mm-hmm.
There's some humor there. And I think that's really important part of emptiness is to be able to laugh. That's what I was referring to. Hillman and I laughed a lot over serious things. Laughed a lot, really enjoyed things. Do we have time? I can give you
Yeah,
an
please.
example.
Yeah.
So I went to Cape Cod to give a talk. And I write against using too many words, but I have given way too many talks in my life. But I went to Cape Cod to give this talk. And at the end of the talk, people are asking questions. And this woman stood up and she said, I think everything you've been talking about is mush. And so, I tried to recover the best I could from that comment. And it so happened that between Cape Cod and my house, you can draw a line right through where Hillman lived. So I stopped at his house. I called ahead and said, I'm going to stop by. So he was in his hospital bed. He was going through treatments for his spinal cancer. And so I went up to him and I said, he's in this bed and he's lying back and he's having morphine and all this. And I said, I told him what happened. I said, Jim, I just gave this talk and this woman said that everything was mush. And he struggled to get up out of his bed and he said, she's right. Everything we're doing is mush. He said that she is absolutely right. I'm glad someone said it, he said. And he was so strong. He was in a weak position, but he was so strong saying that she was right, saying it was mush. Just as an example of, and we laughed about that. There's something about laughter, being able to put things in perspective.
Mm.
So I'll just tell you one more thing. There's one story in this book of mine. Uh, a, a lot of the stories, some of the stories are about a figure from the Sufis called Nasruddin,
Mm-hmm.
who is a teacher, spiritual teacher. So in this story, he's in London and he gets on a double-decker bus and goes up to the upper level of the bus. And he sits there for a while and he comes back down to the lower level. And the conductor is there and comes over to him and says, what's wrong, sir? Can I help you? He says, there's no driver. So I think that's quite a profound
Mm-hmm.
story. There's a driver. There's no man upstairs. We talk about the man upstairs. There's a lot in that little story, but it's kind of a humorous story at the same time. There are others like that. And I think that humor tends to bring some emptiness into a lot of things. And I think the sign of somebody who is quite stable and is able to talk about spiritual things is if they have a good sense of humor.
Oh yeah. Yeah. There is a I forget who was talking about this. I want to say Jung may have even written about this. The concern, I know Robert Johnson wrote about it, the concern for folks that don't have a sense of humor. You want to be mindful of that.
Yeah,
It goes back to what you were talking about, this Dionysian Christ pleasure dynamic, being joyful, connected, expansive love, as opposed to that kind of restricted and rigid and don't say that and this is not okay. And
that's right. That's similar. Yeah.
well, I had to, Thomas, this book is, it's a really lovely read. Certainly the way you set it up with these excerpts and stories, and then kind of ways that you kind of navigated and conducted your own process associating to all the stories. I enjoyed it a lot, but primarily because this idea of emptiness is so important for, and again, I don't mean to say this, but for a Westerner that is so concerned about being filled up, wealth and the competition and kind of what we're based on in a democratic, capitalistic, individualistic culture, how much accumulation we take on, and how scary. There's that word again. Emptiness, loneliness, waiting. You said waiting earlier, and I bet people's like heart rate spikes. Waiting is such a scary thing now, and it's like the place where we get pissed off. Like you're late, or why are you making me wait? It's a net. I guess what I'm getting at is how necessary this framework is for folks that are so concerned about being consumed with accumulation. And I'm really grateful for the texts. I mean, all of them. The texts you've written, this work in particular that we're talking about today, and your willingness to connect with me and laugh a little and share your story.
It's been a great pleasure, which is the best word I could find to use. And I thank you for having me. And for, it's amazing for you and I to be able to have this conversation because we do share a lot of perspectives and backgrounds.
Yeah,
that helps.
It sure does. I'm very grateful. Control.